What's the hardest conversation you had to have? When I was young I worked as a lifeguard in the summers, and had taught most of my nieces and nephews to swim. A few years later my younger brother drowned during a whitewater rafting trip on the Snake River, and it took 3 days before they recovered the body. I had to explain to his 3-year-old daughter that I couldn't find her daddy, while she held full faith that I could swim well enough to go get him and bring him home. The hardest part was that she kept bringing it up over and over, because she just couldn't wrap her toddler mind around losing him. Over and over she kept begging me to just try. She's an adult now and doesn't remember those 3 awful days. I won't ever forget them. And #X200B, edit, thank you so much for the compassion and support. I truly appreciate it. I had opened up to my dad about having suicidal thoughts. But instead he got mad at me and said that people who think about killing themselves are weak and stupid. I've kept my mouth shut about it for a few years, but the suicidal thoughts and urges were still persistent, and worse became more frequent. A couple days ago I went to a doctor's appointment and finally broken down and said that my stress and health was being affected by my depression. When I admitted to my doctor about being suicidal, she offered to help me look for a counselor. Hope I find one soon. I was so relieved to finally talk to someone about my problems. I used to think that I'd just be a burden if I talk about them, but it's nice to see that people actually care about me. Phoning my mom and telling her I wanted to see her to discuss something of personal nature with her IRL and not on the phone. She wanted to discuss it on the phone and threatened not to open the door when I would get there. She forced my hand and I had to tell her I'm cutting off any contact with her over the phone. That it was for my personal mental health and there isn't any kind of agreement we could build upon. That she just barges through without any regard for someone else. She begged me to stay in contact. The hardest part was to stick with the word "no." Haven't heard from her directly, only indirect via my brother or sister who are still in contact with her. In retrospect, one of the hardest decisions I had to make, also one of the best ones I ever made. Talking to my parents about why I failed 3 out of my 4 college classes last quarter. I usually never fail and I knew they have super high expectations of me, so once I saw my grades I kind of died inside. It took me a week to even muster up the courage to talk to them because they asked every day about my grades and I felt this guilty fear of their disappointment creeping up on me. I don't know, it's something about my parents making me feel like utter shit for failing even more than I already felt that made that insanely hard. My girlfriend got amnesia and forgot who I was. The hardest part was sitting down and talking with her after me crying over the phone. I looked into her eyes and I didn't see the spark that I always saw when she would look at me before, just blank and confusion. It was me trying to get her to remember anything and showing her cards and love letters and texts she had written me. Worst day of my life. I have developed chronic depression and anxiety from that. We have rekindled our relationship and she loves me again. Still scares me every day. When I volunteered at a hospital I was in transportation services. I was bringing a portable ultrasound device up and a woman who everyone loved as she was just a sweet old woman started talking to me as she does everyone. What I already knew about her from hearing it around or her telling me before was she was in her 90s and led a cool life. She pretended to be a man and got halfway to boot camp before anyone found out, at which point she became a nurse in WW2 where she met her husband. Her husband and her bought a farm where they made some good money, on top of his father having bought some shares in Coke and some other things right after the low point which he inherited. Her husband went to Korea and either lost a leg or became paralyzed in it. I couldn't hear too well why his leg didn't work. When he got back they had a lot of money but also a farm they couldn't take care of well on their own, so they let homeless people moving through the area work for a few weeks where they not only paid them but she taught them first aid skills. They had triplets but one died during labor, so they adopted a child that was an orphan. After a few years they adopted 6 more kids. They had a guest house, a converted old slave house on the property, and during the AIDS crisis she let a few people who were kicked out by their families stay there while getting treatment until they died. She worked hard her whole life and her idea of retirement was teaching first aid classes and some other classes at the Y. When she was too old for that she volunteered at the local library. She loved to talk and was telling me about her plans for next summer. Thing is, rumors travel fast in a hospital and by that point half of the staff knew their favorite patient was going to die. But she didn't yet. She had a huge tumor and on top of that pretty much everything on her was failing. And me and the transport guy I was with just had to smile and listen to plans she'd never get to complete. The hardest one was having to leave my paid internship with a very good boss for my own reason. I had an amazing paid internship while I was in engineering school. My boss and colleagues were amazing people, but it was a government job and I wouldn't get very far or get a better salary compared to most engineering jobs. They liked me a lot because I fixed a lot of their problems as a systems engineer, put better monitoring solutions, we all ate together and even went to bars. They wanted me to stay and told me many times as my internship was ending. I had the hard conversation of telling them I wasn't going to do it, because I wanted to see the private sector and more challenges. It broke my heart. Nevertheless they were happy for me and understood it wasn't realistic. The upside is that I still keep in touch with them and sometimes we hang out at pubs. My dad is mentally ill and has a long history of being manipulative and abusive. I had been trying for years and years to establish healthy boundaries with him to no avail. About 6 months after I got engaged he went off the rails and started saying all kinds of horrible things about my mom, my fiancée, and my fiancée's family. Eventually I had to tell him that he wouldn't be allowed to come to our wedding. He immediately disowned me, called my mom a whore, my fiancé an idiot, and me a bastard child that, to quote him, "You're probably not even mine so I don't care." He then proceeded to go on a small rant about how awesome he is, and that, "My life is awesome without you, so you and I are done." I told him that if he really felt that way, I would hold him to it, that he would not be allowed to be a part of our lives, that he wouldn't learn his grandchildren's names if we ever had kids, and that I won't answer his calls anymore when he decides to change his mind and act like everything is okay again. He laughed and hung up the phone. That would end up being our final conversation. My best friend asked me for forgiveness because he was going to kill himself and he didn't want to die knowing that I hated him. I convinced him to tell me where he was, and then that he needed to get in the car with me, and then that he needed to check himself into the inpatient program. It was a several hours long, exhausting, conversation where I tried to convince him to try one more time before he gave up. I've never been so emotionally destroyed as I was after that night, knowing that the only reason he was still alive was something as small as, "I didn't want you to be mad at me." I was on the receiving end of this. My baby had died and they let me and some family hold his body before they sent it to the morgue. I spent this time trying to convince everyone that he was alive. It was a miracle. He was okay. A couple doctors and nurses came in and tried to calmly but tearfully explain that he was dead. It took about 30 minutes to convince me. People were having to leave the room out of grief because I was so convinced, and it was like having to tell me over and over that he died. It was absolutely the worst thing that ever happened in my life. I had to admit to my parents that I had been pretending to go to college. I was living at home and was enrolled in a small community college. I was doing well with my grades through the midterms, then I got lazy. Literally. I wanted to sleep in every morning. 2 weeks after doing that my mom's work hours changed so she wasn't leaving until noon. Now I had to get up in the morning, but it was too late to go back to school because I had missed so many assignments and lectures. So instead to sleeping in every morning like I planned, I had to get up and pretend to go to school. I carried on like that for about a month before I admitted what I had been doing. I was only days away from no longer being able to officially drop out of my courses. Had I not done that, I might have affected my ability to get into any other program. Lately I have found out that I am not the only person to pull such a boneheaded move. The hardest conversation I've ever had to have was with my ex, in 2014, about 3 months after she decided to break up, leaving me in the worst emotional mess I've ever been in my life. In those months I've had time to think things through and understood what led her to this decision, and wanted for one last time to let her know, on the cold everything AZ, what was on my chest, so we could properly have closure. So I texted her. She was hesitant at first, and I promised to her that all that she would need to do was to hear me out, not even say hi to me if she didn't want to. So we met up at a neutral location, in a sky bar on the terrace, on an incredibly beautiful and tranquil day in July. She showed up, looking as beautiful as ever, but it seemed as though I was looking at a totally different person right now. To both our ease, there was nothing awkward or forced about this. It went as I planned. We sat down, ordered a couple of drinks, and I just went on, calm but firm, to explain that I understood her reasons and what I did in my relationship behavior that might have led her to come to this decision. I comforted her in the way the person who initiates the breakup does normally, to let her know that there were no hard feelings and to thank her for the most amazing 1 year of my life, even have a little laugh about some of our now extinct inside jokes. Finally, we walked down and said our last goodbye in front of the building. The last thing I told her is that no matter where we go in life, how we change or how much time passes, I will always continue loving her, in my heart. And that was it. It was the most liberated I've ever felt in my entire life, and still is to this day. I walked home happy. And hashtag X200B, TLDR met up with X a few months after breakup to tell her everything that was left unsaid and close this chapter of our lives properly. Felt most amazing afterwards. When I was 12, I woke up one Saturday morning and came downstairs to find my older sister crying at our kitchen table. My dad appeared behind me and said we had to talk. Then came the worst 10 minutes of my life as he told me my best friend had been killed the day beforehand. I suppose it wasn't so much of a conversation, more of a sentence. They wouldn't tell me how he died at first, so I secretly watched the news. My friend's dad had become mentally unwell, and he took my friend's life. Any and all conversions I had with my parents, teachers, and other friends were just awful. Telling my teacher in high school that I had been thinking of killing myself. I remember my parents were questioning me about a note they found in my room. They were only trying to help, but I didn't want to talk to them about it, so I escaped back to my school to talk with my teacher since she was the only one I felt comfortable talking to at the time. I remember it was snowing pretty hard and I went to her classroom and cried. She sat me down, hugged me, and just waited for me to talk and didn't force me to. Once I told her everything, she explained to me that she had to tell the counselor, which I understood, but that she would still support me in any way she could. That night I went back home and she promised me that I would see her the next day. She sent me funny videos and pictures that evening and helped me a lot. That was 5 years ago and I'm doing way better. I'm still really close with my teacher, she's more of a close friend to me now, and I'm actually studying to be a Spanish teacher just like her. The hardest part of that conversation was actually admitting to someone I was having those thoughts. I could barely get those words out, but once I did I felt relieved. In the NICU, with the head doctor of the unit and the doctor in charge of my girlfriend's, now wife's, C-section that day. He laid out for us in very simple terms, either we could get an intervention for our son that would be extremely painful and might prolong his life briefly, or we could take him off the ventilator and let him pass. We had known there would be issues with our son. We were well aware of him having a 50% chance of survival due to multiple diagnoses pre-birth. We were prepared for a fully staffed emergency C-section birth followed by a trip across town to a different hospital via ambulance for emergency surgery at the local children's hospital. It could have been months before he would be stable enough to make it home. What we were not prepared for a few hours after his birth was to be told that his condition was worse than any doctor or scan was able to tell, and that we would be, essentially, choosing how our child would die. I still remember the conversation as clear as if it were happening right now. It was not easy for us. It was not easy for the doctors either. We chose the non-suffering route. I only got to hold my son one time, after they took him off the ventilator. The doctors let us be in a room in privacy and he took his last breaths in his mother's arms. We could feel his heart race in his chest any time he heard our voice. He only lived 6 or 7 more minutes in that condition. Telling our first child it was okay to let go, that we love him, and that we will see him soon is the hardest thing I've ever done in my life. It still hurts. Today. Now. We did everything we could. We were fortunate enough to be able to choose the path we took and had some of the best medical professionals on standby ready to do what needed to be done. But there was nothing that could be done. Just 10 hours of life and then final words to my child.